Hello and welcome to Driving Discussions. In this series, we discuss the forces that affect road fuels globally. Driving Discussions is brought to you by Argus Media, a leading independent provider of energy and commodity pricing information. We're now back from summer, and it's about 5 months since the market started self-sanctioning from buying Russian spot diesel cargoes, thus creating the so-called two-tier market. The diesel crack at this stage remains high. The backwardation has softened though, and the market is somehow going through a calmer period, a more quiet period, while it starts looking towards 2023. But there is still that underlying uncertainty about the impact of the European sanctions once they take place next year. My name is Alfonso Berrocal, European Business Development Manager for Oil Products at Argus Media. And to help us to look at the broader picture and the outlook for the diesel market, we have here with us today Francis Osborne, Head of Forecasting in Argus Consulting. Hi, Francis. How are you?
Hi, Alfonso. Very well, thank you. And it's good to be with you today. Interesting times indeed.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much and welcome to this podcast. Francis, let's start taking the temperature to the European sanctions. Do you think that the appetite for sanctions on Russian oil is weakening in Europe?
I think it is creating considerable concern. I mean, even before the crisis flared up back in end of February, not just Europe, but generally the global economy was facing some serious headwinds from inflation, the inevitable higher interest rates that come as well, come with high inflation. And of course, the Ukrainian situation and the widespread sanctions on Russian commodities generally, and not just energy, has boosted inflationary pressures even more. So we're all concerned as consumers, as policymakers, about what lies ahead and the real serious possibility of an economic slowdown and who knows, hopefully not, but potentially also recession. And it's kind of come rather late in the day to some policymakers that actually if you impose sanctions on Russia, which is a really key exporter of crude, refined products, gas, coal to the global market, then you run the risk of shorting the market, creating shortages, pushing prices up, and you're just feeding this inflationary spiral. So we saw the US, for instance, quite quickly push back when the EU announced their sanctions package. The EU wanted to, for instance, impose a ban on the provision of maritime insurance for vessels carrying Russian oil. The US pushed very firmly back on that. They've introduced a notion to include price caps, basically saying that anyone can trade in Russian oil, that as long as they don't pay more than a certain price, and that price is going to be low enough to ensure that Russia doesn't earn much money, if any, from it. That's a whole different discussion, but it's just an illustration that actually the US did wake up to this possibility of shortages and higher prices, didn't like it and tried to do something about it. The EU will go ahead with sanctions. I don't think there's any doubt at all about that. It's too late to reverse that. So by the end of this year, EU will stop buying Russian crude, and by the end of February, Russian product. But the idea of trying to stop those barrels, those tons trading to other nations in Asia, for instance, I think even the EU has lost its enthusiasm to try and stop that. So the EU has basically, I think, now said we're going to take the moral high ground. We're not going to trade with Russia. We're going to ban them from our market, regardless of the impact, which we all know and we read about every day. But they will, I think, allow probably crude more than products, but Russian oil to continue to trade to other regions of the world, principally Asia. The bottom line is that they really want to try and keep the market well supplied. They would prefer Russia not to be earning serious revenues from the trade. I don't think there's much they can do about that. So in that regard, I think, yes, they have lost some of their appetite, but the EU itself will, I'm 99% certain, continue to impose the sanctions package as envisaged. So vis-a-vis diesel, February of next year, 600,000 to 700,000 barrels a day of Russian diesel, which normally flows to Europe, will no longer flow.
Thanks, Francis. No, that's obviously very interesting, particularly probably for those companies who have the ability to trade out of Europe those barrels. But if we focus then on that 99% chances that the European Union sanction Russian diesel into Europe, who do you think it will replace the loss of Russian diesel supply? And if it is actually replaceable at all?
That's the $64,000 question, of course. And I think it's going to excite the market considerably in the coming months. As I mentioned, we, Europe, that is, normally import 600,000 to 700,000 barrels a day of Russian diesel. It's critical to the supply of the European market. Replacing it is not going to be easy. Well, let's start with a bold statistic. Out of that 600,000 or 700,000 barrels a day of normal flow, self-sanctions have probably reduced imports by probably no more than 100, maybe 150,000 BD. Those are spot volumes which used to be bought, waterborne spot volumes. But broadly speaking, Russian diesel is still flowing into Europe on a more almost normal basis, and that is just the cold hard reality that actually Europe really can't do without Russian supply. So replacing it's going to be really very difficult. It can come from a number of sources on paper. It can come from the US Gulf, already a very significant exporter of product, but generally all the US Gulf material tends to flow to Latin America for obvious logistical reasons. And now, of course, we also have the US administration acutely concerned that actually inventory is very low in the US, particularly on the East Coast, and they're worried. They are trying to encourage US refiners, if not to halt product exports, at least not to grow them. They're trying to persuade US refiners to build more stock, but nobody really wants to build stock in a backwardated market. It's crazy economics. So it's very hard to see how this is going to happen. Will there be an outright ban on US product exports? I doubt it, unless, for instance, there was a very serious hurricane season. We lost, or the US lost refining capacity. Product supply was constrained, then I think there might well be some kind of temporary halt to products exports. But anyway, the US on paper does remain a possible source. The Middle East is clearly an obvious source of incremental diesel. There's the Jazan refinery in Saudi is in the process of starting. It's nowhere near operational maximum operations. It's still in startup phase, but it is producing Euro spec diesel, and that is beginning to flow to Europe. So that's an incremental source. The Al Zour refinery in Kuwait similarly is potentially also a source of diesel in the coming months. It's uncertain quite where that unit is in terms of commencing production, but we think it is pretty close to actually start up. But these units do take time to hit their stride, and the availability may be relatively constrained. But nevertheless, if Europe offers decent enough, high enough prices, they will persuade AG refiners to export to Europe, potentially at the expense of the normal flows that they send into Africa and to India and to Asia. Looking further afield, Northeast Asia and Asia generally is long middle distillates, it's long diesel. But it tends to be long because China is very long, and China isn't actually allowing its refining industry or its independent refining sector to operate at a maximum or a high level of utilization for various reasons, which we won't go into now. The government has constrained the operations of the independents, and therefore product exports out of China have been very low. If that were to change, then there would be, I think, a significant increase in Chinese exports, which would certainly release product from the Southeast Asian market generally, which would then eventually flow into the Atlantic basin. You know, on paper, we can replace 600,000 to 700,000 BD of Russian diesel. In practice, it's going to be logistically challenging, and it will only be achieved, I think, at a high price.
Okay, thank you, Francis. So it's clear that the barrels, they may be there, but Europe is going to have to compete for them at a very high price. And looking at price and economics, distillates, I mean, diesel and jet, the prices are exceptionally high at this stage. How will the price of the distillates of the diesel will impact the European diesel demand? And you think this impact in Europe may be different in maybe different regions, or it will be across Europe, it will have a same effect?
Well, I think before addressing that, well, the other sort of important angle to consider is that the situation regarding Russia is impacting diesel from a different direction, from another angle. Gas prices, we all know, and we read every day, are reaching horrifying levels in Europe. You know, we flirted with $100 a million BTU. Those are, you know, we've never seen prices this high before. Gas in Europe, spot gas, is trading at $500 a barrel oil equivalent and more. So we think in terms of high oil prices, spare for the gas market. These are crazy numbers, and it's not really surprising that consumers in Europe and indeed elsewhere in the world, and we're talking here not really the poor old residential consumer. He probably, you know, residential gas users have no choice. They don't have fuel flexibility. They have to take it on the chin. But manufacturers, industrial concerns, power utilities to a very smaller extent, but mainly the industrial consumers, they do have the ability to switch fuels. Many of them already have that flexibility. Others in Europe, we know, are actively seeking to install that flexibility precisely to stop using incredibly expensive gas and to use something else. And the something else can be coal. It is in some cases, it's LPG in some cases, but overwhelmingly it's diesel. Diesel to power on-site power generation facilities and to help the industrial consumer cope with this very high energy price environment. And this means more diesel demand to be met. It sounds paradoxical that we're talking about already trying to replace Russian supply at a very high price, and we're actually adding to that requirement by generating incremental diesel demand in Europe. We don't really have much visibility at the moment about what sort of volume we may be talking about. We do have some data for Germany. Germany is a very important economy, obviously, and very important diesel market. And on the basis of some recent data, we can identify that German diesel demand for these industrial consumers has probably increased by anything up to 100,000 barrels a day. And I think globally we're working to an estimate for incremental diesel demand of about 300,000 to 400,000 barrels a day. So this is unhelpful in a market which is already going to be incredibly tight. And it it's just going to underpin what I can only think is going to be a very strong end to the year for diesel cracks and diesel prices generally. If we look at Northwest Europe, and whatever I say for Northwest Europe is mirrored in terms of Asia, the US, any other refining region, well, diesel cracks, the spread between crude and diesel prices, peaked at $60 a barrel in March. They fell to under $20 by end July. They're back, as you said, to a very high $45 or so. Will they rise higher by the end of the year? I think there's a very real risk. We're not forecasting that necessarily at the moment. We think, we assume, we forecast, whatever word you care to use, that cracks will end the year at around $40 a barrel. That's $145 a barrel in flat price, in outright price terms, or $1,080 a tonne, if you think in mass. But we have to accept that there is a real possibility that prices could be sharply higher than that. Thankfully, at the moment, the long-range weather forecasts are fairly benign and suggest actually a warmer than average winter. That will be very welcome for consumers generally and for prices more widely. But I'm afraid we're going to have a very uncomfortable winter ahead in terms of diesel price.
This potentially, Francis, I guess that it can translate into maybe into unfortunately maybe demand. It may bring some demand destruction along as some part of Europe may use actually diesel to replace gas. The switch to diesel probably will increase the pressure. I want to ask you to conclude the podcast. What is the outlook? What is the outlook for diesel prices in Europe? But probably, I just wonder if obviously this is a forecast only, but if we can look a little bit ahead into 2023 beyond the winter, you think the situation may normalize? I know it's a very difficult question, but you have any views on that?
Actually, it's worse than difficult. It's impossible. The real answer to that is what happens in Central Europe, what happens with Russia, what happens with Ukraine. It's well beyond my competency to try and anticipate a conclusion to the Ukrainian situation. You can create any number of scenarios, and they're all rooted deeply in geopolitics. If the Ukrainian crisis drags on and on, perhaps just eases to an attritional standoff, a stand where nobody's winning, but nobody's really actually fighting a great deal. Perhaps we have an armed truce, so to speak. Then there's no end to this situation, because it's impossible to think that the EU or the West generally will ease up on Moscow and President Putin while that situation exists. So therefore we would continue to have to live without Russian product, without Russian crude, or at the very least continue to trade in an extremely inefficient and expensive fashion. We're going to end up in that sort of situation, exporting crude to India, so to speak, for the Indian refiners to manufacture the diesel to ship it back to Europe. It's crazy, it's illogical. That's how markets will eventually end up working, because price signals will be high enough to allow it to work. On the other hand, perhaps there's a short-term resolution. Perhaps there's regime change in Moscow. Who knows? I've no idea at all. In which case we could be at the opposite end of the spectrum. But I think on current evidence and current developments, we have to expect crude prices to remain strong next year, and I think diesel prices also. Certainly our forecasting at the moment does tend to suggest that the market should settle, find a new normal for trading, but it will be a high-priced trading environment, and we peg diesel cracks very much towards the top end of a normal range, and that probably means prices around 30 to 35 above crude.
Okay, thank you, Francis. This is actually a great insight to a very difficult question. We will keep an eye on the monthly crude and products outlooks. And thank you very much for being with us here today.
A great pleasure. My pleasure.
Thank you. And if you enjoy this podcast, please be sure to tune in the other episodes in our series, Driving Discussions. And for more information on Argus Global Refined Products coverage, please visit argusmedia.com/oil products, and stay safe and see you next time.